economic crisis of 1991 was a culminated outcome of the policy failure in the preceding years. There was a huge macroeconomic imbalance of high current account deficit and high fiscal deficit. The crisis did not develop overnight. It was caused by decades of imprudence. There was reliance on populist measures. It was in that year the Indian government was experiencing huge fiscal deficits, large balance of payment deficits, high inflation level, and an acute fall in the foreign exchange reserves. Moreover, the Gulf crisis of 1990-91 led to an acute rise in the prices of fuel, which further pushed up the inflation level. Reasons for 1991 economic crisis: huge fiscal deficit. Throughout 1980s, fiscal deficit was getting worse due to huge non-development expenditures. As a result, gross fiscal deficit rose from 5.7% of GDP to 6.6% of GDP during 1980-81 to 1990-91. Subsequently, a major portion of this deficit was financed by borrowings, both from external and domestic source. High level of inflation. The high fiscal deficits forced the central government to monetize the fiscal deficits by borrowings from RBI. RBI printed new money that pushed up the inflation level, thereby making the domestic goods more expensive. The rate of inflation rose from 6.7% per annum to 10.3% per annum during 1980s to 1990-91. In order to lower the inflation rate, government in 1991 had to opt for economic reforms. Failure of public sector undertakings. Public sector undertakings were assigned the prime role of industrialization and removal of inequality of income and poverty. But the subsequent years witnessed the failure of PSUs to perform these roles effectively and efficiently. Instead of being a revenue generator for the central government, these became liabilities. The sick public sector undertakings added an extra financial burden on the government's budget. Rise in external debt. The Gulf crisis led to rising fuel prices. The current account deficit was showing a rising trend and was becoming unsustainable. The current account deficit was mainly financed with costly sources of external finance such as external commercial borrowings, NRI deposits, etc. Thus, the balance of payment situation came to the verge of collapse in 1991, mainly because the current account deficits were mainly financed by borrowing from abroad. The economic situation of India was critical. The government was close to default. With India's foreign exchange reserves at USD 1.2 billion in January 1991 and depleted by half by June, an amount barely enough to cover roughly 3 weeks of essential imports, India was only weeks away from defaulting on its external balance of payments obligations. Weak balance of payment situation. Balance of payment represents the excess of total amount of exports over total amount of imports. Due to lack of competitiveness of Indian products, India was not able to earn enough foreign exchange through exports to finance our imports. The current account deficit rose from 1.35% to 3.69% of GDP during 1980-81 to 1990-91. In order to finance this huge current account deficit, Indian government borrowed a huge amount from the international market. Consequently, the external debt increased from 12% to 23% of GDP during the same period. On the other hand, Indian exports were not potent enough to earn sufficient foreign exchange to repay these external debt obligations. This BOP crisis compelled the need for the economic reforms. Government of India's immediate response was to secure an emergency loan of USD 2.2 billion from the IMF, International Monetary Fund, by pledging 67 tons of India's gold reserves as collateral. The Reserve Bank of India had to airlift 47 tons of gold to the Bank of England and 20 tons of gold to the Union Bank of Switzerland to raise USD 600 million. These moves helped tide over the balance of payment crisis temporarily and kick-started PV Narasimha Rao's economic reform process.